everyone. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Uh, Dr. Gibson, Julia, everyone. Brian, Deborah. Good to see so many people. Um, just going to give it a few more minutes here, seconds here, before we get started. Um, we're very excited about our presenter today, uh, Warren Eugene Milteer. uh, Jr., who is an professor at George Washington University. And he will be presenting today on his book, Out of This Strife Will Come Freedom. And we look forward to hearing, his presentation on that. And it's always good to see so many. And as you know, we take a break during the summertime, which I will announce later. So we will not have another session again until September. But so we're going to kick off this session today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jordan Lloyd, who will give us an update on the announcements that we have. Jordan?
Good morning, everyone. How are you all? We have got lots of announcements. They are in our newsletter, which you should have received this morning. And we do send out a newsletter on a monthly basis that highlights events in and around the New England area. The first announcement that we have to make is actually a digital announcement. It is a reposting of a forum that Egypt and myself participated in. It's called Together We Rise, the collective launch of the Descendants Forum. You might remember Ginny Williams, our presenter from last month. She, along with others, have created a Descendants Forum where we're linking descendant communities throughout the United States. We had our official launch on May 18th last month with Soledad O'Brien, the journalist, working as our moderator. So it's really exciting. And if you'd like to take a look at that, we do have a recording of it. Our next event, The World of Chibuzo, presents What to the Slave is the 4th of July, a live reading of Frederick Douglass's seminal work with music at the Morse School. That's going to be on Saturday, June 20th, on Juneteenth weekend, from 5:30 to 8 at 40 Granite Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it is free. So that is definitely something that if you're in the area, that might be a wonderful thing to enjoy. It's co-sponsored by Mass Humanities, Mass Cultural Council, and the Friends Morse School. Um, History Cambridge, they have a symposium coming up, Landmark, a symposium on enslavement, resistance, and the revolution. It's this coming Saturday, June 13th, from 11 to 3 p.m. at the Cambridge Public Library in their lecture hall. Again, this is free, and but registration is required. It's going to be the exploring the stories of three enslaved people, um, Mark, Phyllis, Phoebe, and what they had to do in order to break free, their life, their resistance. It should be a wonderful symposium. Next up, the Clotilda Descendants Association is sponsoring their landing event and ancestral festival next month in July, from July 9th through July 12th in Africatown in Alabama. And that is a pretty extensive event, a multi day event. We do have a link to that. So if you're hoping to travel a bit during the summer, if you're thinking, how can I celebrate the summertime? Maybe that might be a great way to continue the scholarship that you're so interested in. A free exhibit, Revolutionary Spaces, Slavery and Resistance in Colonial Massachusetts. We do have more information about that exhibit as well. So if you'd like to take a look, they also have the exhibit is at, excuse me, is at the Old South Meeting House and the Old State House in downtown Boston. And it also includes a 60 to 75-minute tour. Um, Great way to further investigate our nation's 250th anniversary, as well as slavery and resistance during that time, that America was fighting for their freedom, but also what were the enslaved at that time up to. Those are our announcements for this month. We're so grateful to have you all. Thank you so much for attending this lecture today, and I'd like to turn it back over to Dennis Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Jordan Lloyd. I am very happy this morning uh, to introduce our speaker and Warren Milteer. He is an associate professor of history at George Washington University, located, as you know, in Washington, D.C. He received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has an extensive number of articles and books, which he has published over the years here, and one of which he will be speaking on today, which is Out of This Strife Will Come Freedom, which was recently published. And so we're very happy to have Warren be able to speak on this publication. Uh, Over the years, he's received a number of awards and recognition for the work that he's done. And I hope that you've had an opportunity to read his bio, which is included in our monthly newsletter. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Warren Milteer. And Warren, if I'm going to turn it over to you.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. Let me see about sharing my screen really quick. All right. So I think you all can see that. So yeah, today I wanted to talk about my new book, Out of the Strife Will Come Freedom, Free People of Color and the Fight for Equal Rights in the Civil War Era. This is a book that I've been working on off and on, or at least the idea, for several years. And so now I have this book. It's my fifth book about free people of color. But this is the first time I've looked at free people of color from a national viewpoint. So what I wanted to do before I get into the rest of the PowerPoint is just read a little bit from the book, and talk about some of the big ideas that I try to get across in this work. So at the beginning of the book, I state, on a spring day in 1894, John G. Tyker, a special examiner for the Federal Pension Office, went to see 67-year-old John Carr of Norfolk County, Virginia. John Carr was a veteran of the late Civil War, and Tyker was visiting in order to interview Carr about his military service that had begun nearly 30 years prior. During their conversation, Carr described his enlistment, his wartime injuries, and even the time he had been arrested while serving in the U.S. Army. Yet Carr placed particular emphasis on the story of his origins. He stated, "I was born and raised in Aspen County, Virginia." More importantly, Carr noted that he was, quote, "freeborn, never belonged to anyone." Almost 3 decades had passed since the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of approximately 4 million enslaved people, but John Carr still stated proudly that he was, quote, "freeborn and never belonged to anybody." Carr was one of nearly 500,000 free people of color who lived in the United States during the period of the Civil War. Nevertheless, little is known about the specific experiences of individuals like Carr. Free people of color, free people of color have certainly appeared in histories of the antebellum years, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Historians, however, have done little to examine the lived experiences of free people of color in a way that highlights their distinct position in Civil War era society. And so, with this problem, I decided to come up with a solution, which was this book about free people of color during the Civil War. So, this is the first book that focuses specifically on free people of color in this time period. Let's see. There we go. So in this image here, you can see the document in which the quotations that I just mentioned came from. This is part of the Civil War pension file for John Carr, where he states that he never belonged to anyone, that he was freeborn. And this particular example brings up one of my major arguments, and here are some of the larger arguments that the book lays out. Free status was important to the ways free people of color experienced life in the antebellum Civil War and Reconstruction periods. That free people of color had years of experience dealing with inequalities, and that helped to shape their responses to the Civil War and Reconstruction. That free people of color were leaders in the fight for equal rights, and that background that they had in the pre-Civil War period helped them to fight for equal rights and civil rights legislation in the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, and that free people of color had an outsized role in promoting societal change during Reconstruction that I think has gone undernoticed, if not unnoticed altogether. And then a few major questions that the book deals with. What was the situation of free people of color in the years immediately preceding the Civil War? And so I deal with this in the first couple chapters of the book. There are 5 chapters total. The first chapter deals with the North, the second chapter deals with the South, and this is kind of the pattern of the book. And then we get into the Civil War period. I have a North chapter, South chapter, and then there's a final chapter about Reconstruction that deals with both sections of the nation. Another major question, how did free people of color respond to the conditions they lived under in antebellum America? How did the Civil War change life for free people of color? How did free people of color seek to reshape their own world during the war? How did the war's conclusion and aftermath alter the lives of free people of color? And how did free people of color take advantage of the new order created by the Civil War and Reconstruction to push for equal rights and change and improve their lives? So before I go more in depth into the examples that I use in the book to answer some of those questions and deal with some of those arguments, I just wanted to give you a basic sense of the demographics as far as free people of color are concerned. So I mentioned there were about 500,000 free people of color in the United States on the eve of the Civil War in 1860. Slightly more than half of that number was situated in the South, while the rest were situated in the states and territories that we broadly would define as the North. And you can see in this chart the breakdown of free people of color in different areas of the North. There are a few territories that are excluded from the chart where there were less than 100 free people of color, or in the case of Dakota Territory, there were none in 1860, according to the census. But you can see that the vast majority of free people of color are living in the mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and as far as the northern states are concerned, there are fewer free people of color as you go further west. And then in the South, the free people of color are primarily located in what we would define as the Upper South, states that some people may argue are not even part of the South anymore, but for today they are part of the South. So places like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Delaware, Washington, D.C., Kentucky. But then you do have a significant population of free people of color in certain parts of the Deep South, especially in Louisiana and New Orleans, which New Orleans had about half of that population. South Carolina had a decent sized population of free people of color. And you can see that as you go down on this chart, that the areas that had the smallest populations of free people of color tended to be areas of the Deep South. Um, there's an interesting story about Arkansas that I'll try to mention as we go through the slides. So first, I want to talk about what is going on with the situation of free people of color in the period immediately before the war. So my first two chapters cover approximately the 1850s to about 1860, 1861. And so free people of color in the North are facing a variety of challenges, but there are a lot of opportunities being in the North as well. Um, one of the major challenges that free people of color, of course, are facing is discrimination. Um, and discrimination looks different in different sections of the region. So you have transportation segregation, which is all over the country. You have exclusion from public schools, which exists in some parts of the country and not in others. In this particular example from on the slide, this is a quotation that comes from Frederick Douglass about a trip that he made to Ohio in the 1850s. And during his trip, he experienced the variety of different types of transportation segregation or lack thereof that appeared in the North. So, in some parts of his trip, he encountered no segregation. In other parts, he was forced to be in an inferior car, or he was at one time on a stagecoach, and the stagecoach person wanted him to be on top of the stagecoach. He couldn't ride inside. So there's all different types of things going on. Ultimately, in order for him to get back home further east, he had to hire private transportation. So that's, a couple of the things that free people of color are facing. There are free people of color who are successful before the Civil War and actually pushing back against some of this segregation, including transportation segregation. There are lawsuits that are filed. There are challenges that are brought at the Supreme Court level. The state Supreme Court is trying to push it back against some of this. At the same time, one thing that I noticed looking at the North as a whole is that free people of color, even when they're facing discrimination, they have the opportunity to push back against that discrimination in a way that you generally don't find in the South by the 1850s. So they're able to speak out publicly, both through speeches and newspapers, pushing back against discrimination and also pushing back against slavery. And so in this particular example that you see on the screen, this is a poem published in a newspaper written by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Watkins Harper was originally from Maryland, but had moved north by this time period and was publishing and speaking about slavery and pushing for its end. Now, I wanted to switch to the South really quick and give you a sense of what's going on in that region in the 1850s. So, depending on where you are, there's a bit of chaos taking place in certain parts of the North. I mean, excuse me, in certain parts of the South. It's pretty clear by this moment in the 1850s that something is not quite right, that society is changing, that there are major shifts taking place as far as the power of the pro-slavery element and the white supremacist elements in the region. And so this particular quotation that you see on the screen comes from a man named John P. Green. At the time of the 1850s, he was a young person living in New Bern, North Carolina, with his mother and family. And there they witnessed a lot of like small aggressions, and those small aggressions, I think, for certain people, um, created fear, and they were concerned that the small aggressions would become larger aggressions. And many people decided to leave the South, including Green's family, who ended up in Ohio. And so this quotation talks about some of those small aggressions and people's response, particularly in New Bern. Um, in some parts of the country, there were much more extreme things going on. And so this goes back to what I was talking about earlier when I mentioned Arkansas and the small population of free people of color. So I think on the chart it says 144 free people of color were enumerated in Arkansas in 1860. There were actually about 600 of them there in the prior census in 1850, but a lot of them had left by the taking of the 1860 census because Arkansas had passed a law threatening to enslave free people of color if they did not leave the state. So that's kind of the more extreme form of what's going on with pro-slavery radicalism and how it relates to free people of color. Proposals to expel free people of color from other states did come up, but they were largely defeated at various levels of government and were never implemented in the way that they were implemented in Arkansas. Now, despite the fact that there's all this conflict that's taking place in the South, there are free people of color still finding a place in the 1850s, including Levi Rogers, who owned this particular stand. And this was in Chestertown, Maryland. You can still see this building there today, of course. And so in Chestertown, Levi Rogers owned this oyster shop. It also served as an ice cream shop at certain times of year. Of course, there are free people of color doing a variety of other things in the economy in the South. You have free people of color who are mechanics, they're blacksmiths, they are doing some of the more hard tasks in the South. There are free people of color who are planters. So they in many ways are very integrated in the economy of the South. And I argue that's part of the reason that many of them remain there. And that's why, despite all the things that are going on, free people of color, the majority of free people of color are still in that region by the time the Civil War breaks out. Beyond their businesses, free people of color are building institutions in the South. Now, those institutions look quite different depending on where you are. In some areas, they're very limited to almost non-existent. In other places, especially places with large populations of free people of color, such as Baltimore, New Orleans, you see institutions such as churches, social clubs, things of that nature that allow free people of color to interact, perform some type of leadership, engage, think about the future, all those types of things. So that is taking place in the South. However, they are not able to say, publish newspapers and say, I want the end of slavery. That's not, they may think that, but they're not going to be able to say that out loud in the way that you might be able to say that in New York or in Boston or somewhere of that nature. Now let's move on to the Civil War and talk about what's going on with free people of color in the Civil War. So when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, free people of color in the North are trying to figure out what are they going to do. Is this something they want to be a part of, or is it something that they don't see themselves being attached to? I think a large number of free people of color look at the war and they recognize that the war is about slavery and that the end of slavery is of some benefit to them, if not just that they actually care about slavery's end for the humanitarian aspect of that. Um, and so early on, we see a lot of debate, public debate going on among free people of color as far as them trying to decide to what degree do they want to be engaged in the war. Do they want to fight? Should they fight? Should they, supply the U.S. government with other types of support? And so there's a lot of back and forth, but ultimately we see that the free people of color who want to be a part of this and want to be a part of the fight went out by 1862 into early 1863 with changes in federal policy around the enrollment of free people of color and people of color more broadly in the U.S. Army. We start to see regiments made up of free people of color in particular popping up in this early time period. Free people of color are also engaged in recruiting troops. So Frederick Douglass is a famous example. John Mercer Langston was another famous example of people who engaged in the recruitment of troops early in the war. Among the individuals who were early recruits was Milton N. Holland. He served in the 5th U.S. Colored Infantry, which was made up primarily of free people of color from Ohio. And so Holland had actually recruited some of his own men and then brought them with him when John Mercer Langston was going through the Midwest recruiting people. John Mercer Langston was actually recruiting at first for some of the Massachusetts regiments and then took on work recruiting for the state of Ohio after the governor of Ohio realized that he didn't want to lose all the numbers that were going to Massachusetts. And so this quotation that you see on the slide is a quotation from John Mercer Langston about Holland and another man who was also doing similar work, Thomas Grimes, and their influence in getting people to serve in the army. Now, when they were enrolling in early 1862 and in the middle of 1862 and early 1863, there were some problems. Two major issues faced the people who were enlisting in the U.S. colored troop regiments. One was discriminatory pay, so they were not being offered the same pay that white soldiers were being offered. And then two, they had issues concerning promotion. So they were largely being kept out of the commissioned officer ranks. And so that is something that they try to challenge as the war is going on. They're free people of color in particular who are pushing back against these policies. And one of the key individuals who's involved in this debate is Stephen Swales of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. So the governor of Massachusetts had suggested that Swales be promoted to become a commissioned officer after his bravery in battle. And so there's a back and forth between the governor and the Department of War concerning this attempted promotion. At first, there's a pushback saying that because he's of African descent, he can't become an officer. And these documents, I was able to find the file actually going through, step by step what's happening. And there's one interesting document. It's not signed, but it gives some of the logic behind the decision not to give Swales his promotion. And it's not simply that he was of African descent, but it was about how white people would respond to a person of African descent potentially giving orders to them. And so you can see in this quotation part of what is in this document. It says the real question presented then is, are white officers and men prepared to acknowledge and obey the colored man or officer as a military superior? If they are ready to treat such an officer with the respect and deference due from the inferior in rank to the superior in rank, there can certainly be no harm in giving the colored man a commission. However, if on the other hand, such action should be in advance of public opinion and of Army ideas and convictions, would not the bestowal of commissions upon colored men introduce in the Army a disturbing element which might be of serious injury to the service? Now, whoever came up with this idea didn't think about the fact that not giving these men their proper rank was also an injury to the larger service. There were people of color who said, if I can't move up the ranks like I should be able to, I don't want to be a part of this army. So they are, the military is potentially losing good soldiers because of the policy. Now, ultimately, with the governor's pushing and prodding, he's able to get the Department of War to finally give Swales his promotion towards the end of the war, and he's promoted to second lieutenant. Now, my discussion of free people of color during the war in the North is not just about military service, but I also go into the other activities of free people of color, how certain people are raising money for the formerly enslaved people and the newly emancipated people. You have people who are involved in the education of the freed people, including Charlotte L. Fortin, who's in this picture. And you see this quotation where she says, I never before saw children so eager to learn. Coming to school is a constant delight and recreation to them. They come here as other children go to play. And she wrote several articles describing her experience teaching, and this was in South Carolina among the freed people. So that's an interesting source for anybody who wants to go deeper into this story. Now I want to switch over and talk about the experiences of free people of color in the South during the war. And so in the South, free people of color are facing different challenges, I would say, than those free people of color who are situated in the North or in parts of the South that are controlled by the U.S. Army. So the U.S. Army does have control over a good portion of the Upper South, places like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and of course, Delaware. And so the free people of color there are not necessarily facing the same plight as those who are living further south. So early on in the war, the rebel government at the national level and also at the state level, they are concerned about labor and trying to get people to work to build fortifications, to um, increase railroads, things of that nature. And so free people of color are looked to do a lot of this work early in the war. And so you can see in 1861 that free people of color are already in place doing this construction of railroads, building fortifications, digging trenches, all of that kind of work. One place where they're employed is in this image, Fort Macon on the coast of North Carolina. Another place is Fort Hughey in Virginia. And so this is a place you can actually go to today and see the earthworks that were built by free people of color. There are a list of names of the actual individuals who built this fort. So we know a little bit more about them than we do in some other cases. In addition to performing labor, free people of color are also important to the economy in the rebel states. Many of these free people of color, of course, were important before the war, and they continue to be as the war is going on. One of these individuals was Richard Dariff. He was located in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was a wood dealer. And so there are records of him actually selling wood to the rebels during the war. He and several other elite free people of color in Charleston um, tried to publicly pledge allegiance to the rebels and support the government of South Carolina during the rebellion. These people had a lot to lose, and so this was their approach to dealing with the situation. And I would say that it's possible that some of these people actually backed the rebellion in a serious way as well. A few of them were actually slave holders, so they had something to lose in this and ultimately would lose something in this war. Now, as the war is going on, the U.S. Army is, I would say, pretty quickly taking back territory that the rebels claimed as part of their country. Um, And one of these areas that is taken very early is New Orleans. So New Orleans has already fallen by 1862, and the U.S. Army is there, and they're going to stay there through the rest of the war. And when the U.S. Army gets to New Orleans, they encounter the Louisiana Native Guard. So the Louisiana Native Guard was um, basically like a home guard unit made up of free people of color. And these free people of color had played a more ceremonial role when New Orleans was held by the rebels. But after the U.S. government and the U.S. Army comes in, they immediately switch over to the U.S. side of the war and become one of the first regiments made up of men of color in the U.S. Army. They have their own officers who, as the war goes on, many of them will actually get pushed out as the U.S. government tries to implement its general policy of not having officers of color. And in this image, you see some of those early officers of color in the Native Guard. Now, quickly, I just wanted to talk about what's going on in territories of the South that are held by the United States and what free people of color are doing there. Beyond joining the Army, you have free people of color who are working in hospitals, they're teaching, they're starting to get involved in some of that equal rights movement activity. And this particular example here is this is an image of a hospital located in Baltimore where there was a group of free women of color who were called the Colored Ladies Union Association. And at this hospital, they took care of members of the U.S. colored troops who were um, injured or fell sick during the war. Those people would be brought back from the South and brought up into Baltimore. Now, I quickly wanted to mention something about the equal rights activities that are taking place beyond the Army. And some of the examples that I talked about earlier with pay discrimination and rising through the ranks, there are also free people of color who are very focused on changing the laws of the United States and building equality into federal law. They have seen, even as free people, that more needs to be done in order for people to have equality. Freedom and equality are not the same, and it's very clear to them. And they see this as their moment. And so the New Orleans Tribune is one of the early organs pushing for equal rights. And this is a newspaper, of course, published in New Orleans, Louisiana, published by free people of color, including Louis Charles Rouenet, who was a doctor in New Orleans. And the newspaper covers a lot of war news. It covers issues about the freed population. It covers information about equal rights events, speeches, things of that nature, and getting that information out to people. Now, I know we're running out of time, so I would want to quickly talk about the last section of my book, which deals with Reconstruction and what is going on in the North and South concerning free people of color in that time period, which we could say is roughly from 1865 to the 1870s, 1880s. I mean, there's a lot of debate even today amongst historians as far as when did Reconstruction really start and when did it end. I think most people would agree Reconstruction was definitely over by the end of the 19th century. So during this time period, we see free people of color really mobilizing for change. Free people of color are actively pushing for some of our most important constitutional amendments, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. They're pushing for the Civil Rights Acts of the Reconstruction period. And you can find documentation of this in the National Archives where you can see their petitions that they've signed supporting these different changes in federal law. And they are heavily focused on federal changes, although they're doing work at the state level too, because they realized from their experiences in the pre-war period that laws needed to be changed at the federal level in order to have a more uniform set of equal rights across the nation and not this hodgepodge that had existed. And also, the hodgepodge can be easily changed when it's just at the state level. So, for instance, there are many northern states during Reconstruction that, at the beginning of Reconstruction, that still don't allow free men of color to vote. And it's only with the changes in the Constitution in which free men of color are finally able to vote in those states. Now, that voting allows changes in the political scene of the South in particular, but also in the North. And so we start to see free people of color and other people of color elected to public office. A couple of examples that I wanted to talk about were PBS Pinchback and Hiram Revels. So PBS Pinchback was actually a member of the Native Guard that I talked about earlier. He had resigned during the war. And after the war, he gets involved in Louisiana politics. He becomes a member of Louisiana's General Assembly and eventually moves up to become the lieutenant governor of Louisiana. He's the second person of color to serve as lieutenant governor of Louisiana. Um, and briefly, he actually serves as the acting governor of Louisiana during the impeachment of Henry Warmoth, who was the governor that he was serving under. People debate whether we should actually consider him the first person of color to be a governor in the United States or not, but he definitely was an acting governor during Reconstruction. And then with Hiram Revels has a really interesting story. He was originally from North Carolina. Before the war, he had moved north. He was a minister. He had gained his education in that region as well. After the war, he heads south and eventually ends up in Natchez, Mississippi. He serves in local government there for a short time before moving up to the state legislature in Mississippi. And from there, he is appointed to the U.S. Senate and becomes the first person of color to serve in the Congress of the United States. At the same time that all these political changes are taking place among free people of color, there's also a lot of work being done by free people of color in education. Because free people of color were disproportionately among those who could read and write among the larger population of color, many of them take on the role of teaching um, both in all regions of the country. There are many who had lived in the northern states who moved south to help in those areas where people had less opportunity. One of those individuals was Marianne Shadd Cary. Now, Marianne Shadd Cary was originally from Delaware. Before the war, she had moved to Canada. And then when the war started, she came back, was active in recruiting. And then when the war is over, she gets involved in a variety of different things, including education, women's rights, and also the larger equal rights movement. Um, as far as being an educator, she takes an important role in the schools in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. had a segregated public school system for people of color, and she was high up in the D.C. public schools in that time period. Now I'm going to stop and take questions. I appreciate your attention and look forward to seeing what you all have to say. Thanks.
Warren, thank you very much. That was very comprehensive and interesting uh, uh, history. My question is that there is so much history evolving around, certainly enslavement, and slavery during this particular period. Is this going to be a series of books that are going to focus on?
I haven't thought about it that way yet, but you never know what the future will bring. I've got a lot of material.
All right. That's good because this clearly, has opened up the door to and provides us with a lot of, unknown knowledge on this time period. So, and clearly, out of strife, has come freedom, and which is a story that continues. So, you know,
Absolutely.
thank you for this presentation. Uh, we do have some questions. Jordan, uh, are
Uh,
they in the, yeah,
yes, we do have questions. Let's see, I think that we did. No, we don't have any questions just yet. Oh, sorry. Yes, the hands are raised. Mike Potaski, would you like to share your question?
You. Excellent presentation, Professor Milteer. Uh, a focus of my research is Savannah immediately after Sherman captured the city. Uh, the American Missionary Association immediately dispatched a number of teachers to the city. They discovered that the free people of color in Savannah, particularly ministers and other literate individuals, had already established schools for the newly emancipated Black population. And there arose a period of tension between the AMA and the free people of color down there. Do you address this particular aspect of education in your book?
I do not. I did not focus on that particular case. It sounds like a really interesting case. I know I was aware that there were some free people of color who were involved in education even before the war, so I'm not surprised to hear this, that they were doing this during once Sherman came in. But yeah, that's really fascinating and
If
fits
I can,
well.
if I can offer a suggestion, the AMA archives are resident in the Amistad Center in
Right,
Tulane University.
right.
It makes fascinating reading. I spent 2 visits to New Orleans going through the material in there, and I have one more visit planned later this year. It's a fascinating look at the various young women from different levels of education who suddenly found themselves in Savannah treated as unwanted carpetbaggers because they were interfering in an educational process that had already begun in Savannah.
Right. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
Miss Barbara Brown, can you please go ahead?
You're
Put on your voice.
You're currently
you're
You remind me of the people I know I've researched in Massachusetts who are part of the efforts post-Civil War. But my question really is, I want to know more about the term free people of color. Does
Yeah.
that include indigenous people? And how did you choose that instead of, say, African Americans or blacks?
Yeah, so yes,
Real term.
yes to the first question about indigenous people. A lot of indigenous people, especially on the East Coast, are often classified as people of color. I mean, I chose the term because this is the most common term that these people use for themselves during this time period. I think that's pretty clear from the records that, I mean, they when they have a convention, it's called a, convention of people of color. Um, this is the respectful term that they use, and so that's the term I adopt.
Thank you. That makes sense.
yeah.
Thank you, Miss Brown. We've got one in the chat before we get to Mr. Michael Fitzgerald. One second. I did see that we had one question in the chat. Barbara Matthews had a comment. I found the book about the 3rd Black Regiment raised in Massachusetts, the 5th Volunteer Cavalry. So thank you for sharing that book recommendation. Beth, I think, has a question though from History Cambridge. She's wondering, Warren, if you can speak to class issues within Black communities during the time, particularly around the ideas of quote unquote Black advancement and what that should look like. Were there competing versions of Black success before, during, and after the war? And where were these tensions among Black thinkers and leaders about whose vision should prevail?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. There are class tensions and divides that, especially if we're looking at I guess the way the question is suggesting that free people of color and the freed population, yeah, there definitely divides there. And some of that's class related. As I mentioned earlier, there are free people of color who were slaveholders in the pre-war period and during the war itself. And some of these individuals are involved in Reconstruction politics, and end up in public office. For instance, DeRiff, who I mentioned earlier, he was actually a Democrat during his time period, while the vast majority of people of color were Republicans. But even among those free people of color who became Republicans during Reconstruction, you have some of them who, I would question, what their actual interests are beyond their own personal interests and those of their in group. And I found documentation where, there are free people of color and populations that descend from free people of color who continue to see themselves as distinct well after the Civil War. And this is particularly in the South.
Michael Fitzgerald, would you like to?
To follow up on that answer, actually, I did a book on Mobile, and so I've been kind of interested in the role of Afro Creoles on the Gulf Coast. And I found that during Reconstruction, a lot of the factionalism is sort of like freeborn or Afro Creoles versus freedmen coming in from the countryside, and they're fighting over politics and patronage. Did you find much resentment for the Afro Creole, or do you want to say anything about their role in the Gulf states?
Yeah, I mean, as far as resentment, I would say that I was not engaging with sources specifically about that, but I mean, that kind of stuff definitely those kind of conflicts continued on well beyond, I would say, into the 20th century.
Yeah.
Those resentments are definitely there because many of these free people of color see themselves as distinct. They're often related to one another in these smaller communities. Um, and there's like the idea of Black community makes no sense to them. And so, that's something that people are bringing in when they're analyzing these situations today. They're bringing that in and imposing it on those people. That's not how they viewed themselves in that time period. And yeah, those distinctions and that history was meaningful, and people hadn't forgotten. I mean, I wouldn't expect anything less, because in some parts of this Gulf area, you do have free people of color who have been slaveholders, and the people who they enslaved know who they are. They know the difference between those people who are their allies and those people who were not, always their allies. That kind of stuff means something to them. So.
Okay. My own impression also is that most of the Afro-Creole population went with Reconstruction, went with the Republican Party, but they saw themselves as the natural leaders for the larger Black community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, they need a constituency.
Yeah.
But having constituents and thinking your constituents are equal, two different things. I'm sure we have plenty of politicians today who don't think that the people they represent are their equals. So I think that's something we have to be careful about when we're thinking about the two.
Well, thank you very much.
No problem.
Were there any other questions from folks? Oh, yes, Julia. Yeah. Oh, you'll have to unmute. Okay, I think you're doing that. Or hold on.
I like the Sharon Styles question that's in the chat.
Hold on. Yes, we will get to that in just 1 second. We've got someone asking a question right now, and then Mr. Jones will get to you next.
Okay, this is to build on Dennis's earlier thought about other books and other publications to come out of your work. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. You said 500,000 people in the U.S. in 1860 were freed Black people. And then you drilled down per state. I mean, it's almost as if there's a story in each state as to how their lives unfolded given that. And I can imagine many books coming out of that, because in the past, many of us are familiar with freed Blacks only through occasional appearances in literature, and then they're presented as if they're an anomaly. So what you're doing is really groundbreaking and wonderful. Specific question about Mr. Swales. Once promoted, was he obeyed by the people in his regiment, both white and Black?
So the people in his regiment would have been, I guess those who ranked below him would have all been people of color.
I see.
I actually have not looked into the details of that. The war was about over by the time he got his promotion.
I see.
So I'm not sure about all those details as far as what that looked like. But there's a book about him that's been written where you could probably look into that and find out exactly what happened.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm always interested in how how new ideas are actually integrated into society and how people respond as a result. Thank you. You're just down the street from me in DC, so I may see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we do have another question in the chat, and this originated from Ms. Sharon Stiles, and there's a lot of interest in getting the answer. But how many of the Black slaveholders own their family members to, quote, save them from slavery?
I mean, yeah, there's going to be a percentage of those people who are doing that for sure. I couldn't give you numbers off the top of my head. I think you probably are going to see more of that in certain regions of the country than in others. But the people that I'm speaking about, these elites in South Carolina, some of these folks who are down in Louisiana, like they own people for profit. It's pretty obvious that that's what they're doing. These are not their relatives or most of them are not their relatives unless, they're doing what some slaveholders do. There's some of that too. As far as, free men of color who are having children with the slave women that they own. But yeah, so the folks that I'm thinking about are primarily those who are exploiting people to make money, and they own people by the dozens, not, a couple of family members or, their children and their wife or something like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But there is some of that there for sure.
Brian? Yeah, Brian had a comment. Jordan?
Yeah,
Brian Jones.
so if you, Miss Brian Jones, if you wanted to add on to that, I know that you were interested in.
No, that was my question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, do we have any more?
Yes, it looks like Barbara Brown, you have another question? I saw your hand go up. Oh,
I'm following up on this other person's questions, a woman who just spoke, is I'm wondering if any of this is now getting into either storybooks for children, picture books, or other books, because for sure we've got to think about dissemination of these new ideas and new ways of thinking. And so I'm wondering what you or other people are doing, or if textbooks are changing. Massachusetts, they're finally changing the textbooks, even though it may not be enough. 20 years ago, they didn't include African Americans as part of colonial Massachusetts. So things change.
Right. Yeah, I know I've seen one book on free people of color that's for children. If there are others, I don't know about them, but they could exist. There's so much stuff out here nowadays. But yeah, I think there's plenty of room to, translate the scholarship into a more accessible form for young people.
Yeah, Il-Yun Wu, who wrote the biography of Ellen and William Craft,
Right.
at the end of this month, her book for middle school students is due.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, she's such a good writer, among other things, that this should help. Not your story, but the story that she's been wanting to tell.
Right. I mean, I think their actual narrative is pretty accessible too. So I think some middle schoolers who are advanced could definitely read that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these comments. We have been, and certainly for your presentation, Warren, and for all of the work that you've done to keep the subject of enslavement alive and in the forefront of so many people who, need to know, and for all of us who want to know. So thank you very much. I and now, what are you going anywhere from here? Are you going back to North Carolina, or if you're not there already? I know you've been speaking in the Boston area. Uh, you spoke recently, and
Right, right.
are you continuing that journey anywhere?
Yeah, I'll be in Virginia next week speaking. So if you're in
All
that
right.
area, check that out.
Okay. Okay. Well, the best to you, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to hear you again. Hopefully, when you have your next book, and we look forward to highlighting that. Also, Mike Fitzgerald, you mentioned your book and or your work on uh, Creole enslavement, the relationship of Creoles in New Orleans. That would be an interesting subject at some point if Mike is still here with us. And
I'm here. The only problem is the book came out in 2003. It's not recent, but it's called Urban Emancipation, and it was on LSU, and it really does kind of, the first chapters hit some of these
well,
issues.
I mean, it's not your stories are not they're not dated. I mean, they're continuous history. So but maybe if at some point you are interested in putting on
Yeah,
giving us a presentation, you can
I'd be
contact
perfect.
us. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be perfectly happy to.
Okay. So please contact us and give us your information on our site. Okay, and we'll get back
Okay,
to you. All
will
right.
do.
All right. Well, this will conclude our first half of the year. The first 6 months has gone by very quickly. Our next meeting will not be scheduled until is not scheduled until September, and where we look forward to seeing you for the latter half of the year as we continue our journey and quest to provide information and can keep the legacy and history of enslavement in the U.S. alive as we continue these discussions. We will have now. We are planning in the planning stage right now a trip to Washington D.C. to the Smithsonian Institute, African American Museum, and that will be take place in October. You will receive some information shortly on that, and we will be leaving via train from South Station down to Union Station, and bus there will take us to the museum. We'd like to see as many of you as possible join us, and where we'll stay in DC for a couple of days, do the Smithsonian, and give people a chance to look at the historical sites, other historical sites, and possibly if there's interest, we'll go to Howard University and take a tour of that historically black college, renowned college where I went to school. And anyway, the but we are planning that. So we look forward to seeing you. We will be in touch, and if we don't communicate, many of you and we are in touch with, and we look forward to expanding our conversation with each and every one of you. So please stay in touch. And thank you very much for your support. And we will, if we don't talk, we will, until September, please have a safe, enjoyable summer holiday and vacation. So we look forward to it. And thank all of you. And it's so good to see you. And take care. And Warren, continue your success and your work. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.